Somewhere right now, someone is buying a full copy of Windows for less than the price of a cup of coffee. Not a knockoff, not a cracked version. A real, working Microsoft-issued license that activates instantly and never gets flagged. And the wild part is Microsoft knows exactly why this is happening, and they've built their entire pricing model around pretending it doesn't. Here's the setup. Head to Microsoft's own store right now, and Windows 11 Home will run you around $139. Want Pro with BitLocker and Hyper-V and remote desktop baked in? That jumps to about $200. Those are the real current official numbers. Now open a browser tab next to it, search for a key reseller, and you'll find the exact same Windows 11 Pro license for less than $5. Not a trial, not a workaround. A key that Microsoft's own activation servers will accept without blinking. If you're new here, go ahead and subscribe and tap that notification bell, because we dig into stuff like this constantly. The stuff that sits right on the edge of what tech companies want you to understand, and what they'd rather you didn't think about too hard. And before you assume this is some tiny niche corner of the internet that only a handful of bargain hunters know about, understand that this market is enormous. There are entire storefronts built around nothing but reselling operating system and productivity software keys, some of them pulling in traffic that rivals mid-sized electronics retailers. Search engines are stuffed with comparison sites ranking the best places to buy cheap Windows keys, complete with star ratings, verified purchase badges, and live customer service chat widgets. This isn't a black market back alley. It's a fully mature, semi-legitimate industry operating in plain sight, generating real revenue, employing real support teams, and processing transactions through mainstream payment providers. The fact that most people have never noticed it says a lot about how invisible this entire economy has managed to stay. So I decided to actually test this instead of just reporting on it secondhand. Over the last few weeks, I bought a dozen keys from a dozen different storefronts, some flashy with reviews and live chat support, some looking like they hadn't been updated since 2015. I dug through Microsoft's licensing terms, court filings from 2 continents, and forum threads going back years where people compared notes on which resellers screwed them over and which ones didn't. Every single key I bought worked. Everyone activated. Everyone is currently sitting on a machine, pulling down security updates like nothing happened. Which raises an obvious question. How does a $5 key do exactly what a $200 key does? The short answer is that these keys are almost never fake. They're not generated by some shady keygen tool from 2009. They are authentic Microsoft product keys that Microsoft itself created, activated somewhere in the world, and sold through a completely legal transaction. The catch is that somewhere in the world is doing a lot of work in that sentence. And that's where this entire story actually begins. Microsoft doesn't charge the same price for the same product everywhere on the planet. A Windows license priced at $139 in the US might cost the equivalent of $20 or $30 in parts of South Asia, Latin America, or Eastern Europe. This isn't an accident or a mistake in Microsoft's spreadsheet. It's a deliberate strategy called regional pricing, and on paper, the logic is reasonable. Average income in Lahore isn't the same as average income in Los Angeles, so if Microsoft wants people in lower income markets to actually buy Windows instead of pirating it, the price has to reflect what that market can realistically pay. Lower margin per sale, but a much bigger pool of buyers overall. Here's the thing nobody tells you though. That cheaper license isn't a stripped down version. It's not missing features. It's not some regional edition with fewer capabilities. It is, byte for byte, the same Windows 11 Pro that ships in every other country. The only variable that changed is the number on the price tag. And once people realized that, the math became impossible to ignore. Buy a batch of keys somewhere they're priced at $20, resell them somewhere they're priced at $140, and pocket the difference. The buyer still saves a small fortune, the reseller still makes real profit, and the only party losing anything is Microsoft. And Microsoft is not thrilled about this, to put it mildly. They want buyers in high-income markets paying the high-income price. Full stop. So over the years, they've thrown a lot at the wall trying to shut this down. Region locks on certain keys, rewritten licensing terms explicitly banning resale. Lawsuits aimed at the resellers themselves rather than individual buyers. Pressure applied to payment processors to cut ties with gray market storefronts. None of it has made the market disappear, and there's a specific legal reason why. In most of the developed world, there's a legal concept sometimes called the exhaustion doctrine or first sale doctrine. Basically, once you legitimately buy something, the seller's control over that specific copy ends. You bought it, you own it, and you get to resell it if you want, no matter what the fine print says. It's why used bookstores and secondhand car dealerships exist without publishers or manufacturers being able to sue them out of existence. For a long time, courts treated software the same way. There's a landmark European case from the early 2010s that's still cited constantly in this space. A company was buying and reselling used enterprise software licenses, and Oracle took them to court arguing that wasn't allowed. The case eventually reached the European Court of Justice, and the ruling landed in favor of resale rights. The court's reasoning was that once a software company sells a license, even a downloaded one with no physical disk involved, they have exhausted their distribution rights over that copy. The buyer owns it and can pass it along to someone else, license agreement language notwithstanding. That single ruling reshaped how the software industry thinks about ownership across the entire European market, and its logic still underpins a lot of the legal gray zone that gray market key resellers operate in today. It's worth sitting with that ruling for a second, because it wasn't a minor technicality buried in a footnote somewhere. It directly contradicted decades of assumptions the software industry had operated under. The assumption that a license agreement's fine print was essentially untouchable, that whatever restrictions a publisher wrote into paragraph 47 of a terms document would simply hold up because nobody ever challenges it in court. This case proved otherwise. It showed that a court could look past the label a company put on a transaction and evaluate what actually happened economically. And if what happened economically looked and functioned like a sale, courts were willing to treat it like one regardless of what the paperwork claimed. That ruling terrified an entire industry that had built its business model on selling the same thing to the same customer over and over. Picture what happens if every person upgrading from an old Windows license could just resell the old one. Multiply that by hundreds of millions of PCs. So software companies got clever with their language. They stopped selling you software and started licensing it to you instead. And that distinction matters more than it sounds. When you buy a physical object, ownership transfers to you outright. When you license something, you're renting access under terms the company gets to define. And if those terms say no resale, that's the deal you technically agreed to the moment you clicked I accept without reading it. That's exactly what happened with Windows. You're not buying an operating system anymore in the traditional sense. You're purchasing a license to use it, bundled with restrictions Microsoft writes and can rewrite. And the legal fallout from that shift depends heavily on where you happen to live. European courts have generally sided with consumers, treating a permanent license sale as a sale, full first sale protections included. American courts have been far messier, sometimes siding with software publishers, sometimes with consumers, without a single clean answer either way. It's genuinely one of the more unresolved corners of consumer law right now. But regional pricing differences are only one source of these cheap keys, and honestly, not even the biggest one. There's a whole separate pipeline running through volume licensing, and this is where things get considerably murkier. When a large company buys Windows for thousands of employees at once, they're not paying anywhere near retail price. Bulk purchasing gets them steep discounts, sometimes down to a fraction of what an individual pays at checkout. These bulk licenses, often called volume license keys, can activate large numbers of machines and come with terms specifically restricting them to business use. Companies downsize, merge, migrate to different systems, or simply overbuy and end up sitting on unused licenses. Rather than let them go to waste, some of those licenses quietly make their way into the resale pipeline, get bought up by brokers for a few dollars each, and get flipped to individual consumers who have no idea they're using something that was... Microsoft treats this category far more aggressively than the regional pricing situation, because it directly violates the terms those licenses were sold under. If Microsoft's systems detect a volume key being used outside its intended scope, they can and do deactivate it remotely, sometimes with zero warning. This isn't hypothetical. There have been documented waves of mass deactivations over the years, where people who'd been running perfectly stable Windows installs for months suddenly woke up to license errors, and Microsoft's position was essentially that the risk was on the buyer, not the reseller, and definitely not Microsoft. What made those incidents especially frustrating for the people affected is that many of them had done everything they thought was reasonable. They'd checked reviews, they'd bought from storefronts that had been operating for years without complaints, they'd even gotten confirmation emails and functioning activations that lasted for months before anything went wrong. From where they were sitting, there was no red flag to catch, no obvious warning sign that would have told them to walk away. The deactivation came out of nowhere, often tied to an enforcement sweep on Microsoft's end rather than anything the individual buyer did. That's really the core problem with this entire market. The risk isn't concentrated at the moment of purchase, where a cautious buyer could reasonably protect themselves. It's a risk that can materialize months or even years down the line, triggered by decisions made entirely on Microsoft's side of the transaction that the buyer has zero visibility into and zero ability to predict. And here's the uncomfortable part for anyone considering this route. As the end user, you have no reliable way to know which category a cheap key falls into before you buy it. It might be a completely legitimate regional pricing key protected by exhaustion doctrine. It might be a leaked volume license, one bad update away from getting nuked. There's no label, no certificate, no way to check provenance from your end. You're essentially buying a lottery ticket that happens to also boot an operating system, and that ambiguity benefits exactly one party in this transaction. If buyers stay uncertain and a little scared, more of them default to paying full retail price just for peace of mind. And Microsoft has very little incentive to make the picture any clearer. If you're finding this useful so far, this is a good moment to hit like and subscribe, since it genuinely helps push videos like this one to more people who'd want to see it, and we've got a lot more ground to cover. Now, there's a third source feeding this market that's darker than either of the first two, and it's worth understanding clearly rather than glossing over. Some cheap keys trace back to stolen payment information. The pattern works like this. Someone gets hold of stolen card details, uses them to buy Windows keys directly through Microsoft's own official channel at full retail price, then immediately turns around and sells those keys through gray market sites at a steep discount before the fraudulent charge gets flagged and reversed. From Microsoft's side of the ledger, a legitimate transaction happened. The key is completely genuine. It's just that the money behind it never should have existed in the first place. If you happen to buy a key like that with no way of knowing its origin, you're not committing fraud yourself. You had no visibility into how it was purchased. But it does mean that even a key that activates perfectly and updates normally might be sitting on legally shaky ground you can't see from the outside, and that you'd have no recourse if it eventually got flagged and pulled. Step back far enough and you start to see the real shape of what's going on here. And it has almost nothing to do with Windows specifically. It's about what ownership even means once a product becomes digital. Buy a physical object, and the concept is simple. It's yours, you can use it, sell it, destroy it, whatever you want. Digital products break that model completely. You don't own the underlying code. That's copyrighted and stays Microsoft's property, regardless of what you paid. You don't own the key itself either. It's just a string of characters Microsoft generated and can revoke at will. What you actually hold is permission, a conditional agreement that can be pulled the moment a company decides you've crossed a line buried somewhere in a licensing document nobody actually reads, start to finish. This is precisely why so many companies have pivoted towards subscription and rental models instead of one-time purchases. Creative Software moved to monthly subscriptions years ago. Microsoft has spent years nudging people away from buying Office outright and toward paying for it every month indefinitely. Stop paying, and access simply stops. You never owned the thing to begin with. You were renting continuous access to it. And the moment the payments end, so does the relationship. So where does that leave the actual truth about cheap Windows keys? It's genuinely a patchwork. Some of them sit comfortably inside first sale style legal protections, particularly if they originated from a legitimate regional purchase, somewhere with strong consumer resale rights. Some technically breach Microsoft's terms of service without crossing into outright illegality for the buyer. And some trace back to outright fraud that you'd have no realistic way of detecting. If you buy one, the odds are genuinely decent. It'll work fine indefinitely. My batch of 12 all did. But there's a real, non-zero chance Microsoft eventually deactivates it, and a much smaller chance you end up in some kind of a legal gray zone, though there's essentially no track record of Microsoft going after individual buyers directly. Their legal energy has consistently targeted the resellers and brokers running the operations, not the person who bought one key for their gaming PC. So should you actually do it? That's a personal call, and I'll give you my honest read rather than sitting on the fence. I think Microsoft's pricing structure is built on artificial scarcity dressed up as fairness, charging $139 for something that costs essentially nothing to distribute digitally, while selling the identical product for a fraction of that elsewhere, purely because the local market can bear a lower number, is price discrimination. Plain and simple. It's not really about affordability for lower income regions, so much as it's about extracting the maximum amount each market will tolerate. I don't lose much sleep over Microsoft's gray market revenue leakage, given how that pricing system was designed in the first place. That said, you should walk into this with your eyes open. If your key gets deactivated down the road, your options are buying another cheap one, paying full retail for a guaranteed clean license, or continuing to use Windows unactivated. And that last option deserves way more attention than most people give it, because barely anyone realizes it's on the table at all. You can install Windows and simply never enter a product key, and it still works. You'll get a small watermark in the corner noting it isn't activated, and you lose the ability to change certain personalization settings like your wallpaper or accent colors. But everything functionally important keeps running exactly as intended. Security updates keep arriving, feature updates keep arriving. There's no lockout, no countdown timer, no forced shutdown after some grace period. Microsoft could absolutely make unactivated Windows stop functioning after 30 days if they wanted to enforce it that hard. They don't. And the likely reason is strategic rather than generous. They'd rather have you inside their ecosystem using an unactivated copy than have you abandon Windows entirely for something like Linux or Mac OS. An unlicensed Windows user is still a potential future customer, still someone who might buy other Microsoft products, still someone who might eventually pay to activate. A Linux convert is a customer they've lost outright. That's really the entire balancing act Microsoft is running. charge full price to people who will pay it without blinking, tolerate a gray market for people price sensitive enough to shop around, and quietly allow unactivated installs to exist rather than push those users toward a competitor entirely. It looks inconsistent from the outside, but it's actually a coherent strategy once you see the incentive structure driving it. There are also a handful of completely legitimate ways to lower the cost that most people never bother looking into before reaching for a gray market key. Students frequently qualify for steep educational discounts, sometimes free licenses entirely through school-affiliated programs. Certain employers have benefits or procurement arrangements that let staff pick up personal licenses at a fraction of retail. If you're building a new machine from parts rather than buying pre-built, some motherboard and system builder bundles include an activated license as part of the package, meaning you may already own one without realizing it. And if you're upgrading from a genuinely licensed older version of Windows on compatible hardware, that upgrade path to the current version is typically free, no purchase required at all. None of these routes get talked about nearly as much as the $5 key sites, but for a lot of people, they're a far cleaner way to avoid paying full retail without touching the legal gray zone in the first place. Let's zoom all the way out, though, because this pattern isn't unique to Windows at all. It's the direction the entire tech industry has been moving for over a decade. Music went from something you owned on a shelf to something you stream access to. Movies went from discs to licenses that can vanish from your library if a distribution deal falls through. Video games increasingly live inside accounts that can be suspended, tied to servers that can be shut down entirely, turning a $60 purchase into an unplayable file the instant a publisher decides the game isn't worth maintaining anymore. There have been very public cases of exactly this happening, where an online-dependent game simply stopped functioning once its servers were pulled, leaving purchasers with nothing to show for their money except a license that technically never guaranteed ongoing access in the first place. Executives at more than one gaming company have openly said the quiet part out loud, essentially telling players to get comfortable with not owning what they pay for. That's the destination this entire industry has been steering toward for years. A world where you pay recurring money for continuously revocable access, where terms can shift, prices can climb, features can vanish, and the whole relationship can be terminated by the company at any point, with the fine print having warned you all along that you never actually owned anything to begin with. The cheap Windows key ecosystem exists as a kind of quiet pushback against exactly that shift. People buying these keys aren't usually trying to scam Microsoft out of money for the sake of it. Most of them just want the older, simpler arrangement. Pay once, own the copy, use it as long as it works, resell it if you're done with it, the same way you treat literally any other product you buy. Software companies have spent enormous sums lobbying, litigating, and rewriting agreements specifically to prevent that arrangement from persisting into the digital era. And by most measures, they've largely succeeded. Every year, digital ownership means slightly less than it did the year before. Ebook platforms can pull titles from your library. Movie platforms can lose distribution rights and quietly remove films you paid for. Game platforms can suspend accounts and erase entire libraries, all within the bounds of agreements you technically consented to somewhere in a wall of text you scrolled past. Viewed through that lens, cheap Windows keys start to look less like a scam and more like a symptom, a byproduct of a system where consumers have been slowly and legally stripped of leverage over things they paid real money for, and where a small subset of buyers and sellers found a legal gray area wide enough to push back into. It's also worth noting that this shift hasn't happened by accident or through some inevitable march of technological progress. It happened because subscription and license-based revenue is simply more predictable and more profitable than one-time sales, and publicly traded companies are under constant pressure to show recurring revenue growth to shareholders every quarter. A one-time sale gives a company a single spike of income and then nothing until the customer decides to buy again, whenever that might be. A subscription gives that same company a predictable, compounding income stream for as long as the customer keeps paying, which is exactly the kind of metric investors reward with higher valuations. None of this is a conspiracy. It's just business incentives working exactly as designed, and the natural endpoint of those incentives is a world where ownership as a concept quietly fades out because it's simply less profitable to sell you something once than to keep collecting money from you indefinitely. Now, let's clear up a handful of specific questions people always ask once they hear all this. First, can a cheap key infect your computer with malware? Not directly. A product key is just a short string of characters. It functions like a password and physically cannot carry malicious code on its own. The actual risk lives in shady delivery methods. Some low-quality reseller sites might try to bundle extra downloads alongside the key or push you toward installers you shouldn't touch. The safe move is simple. Only ever download the Windows installer directly from Microsoft's own site, and use the reseller purely as a source for the key itself, nothing more. Second, will your PC still get updates on a gray market key? Yes, completely normally. Once Windows registers as activated, Microsoft's update servers don't distinguish where that activation originated. You get every security patch and feature update on the same schedule as anyone with a full retail license. Third, what happens if your key eventually gets deactivated? You've got the same 3 paths we already covered: buy another discounted key, buy a guaranteed retail license straight from Microsoft, or keep running Windows unactivated with the cosmetic watermark. Plenty of people have lived with an unactivated system for years with 0 functional issues beyond that small notice in the corner. Fourth, are there free alternatives entirely outside this whole system? Yes, absolutely. Linux distributions like Ubuntu and Linux Mint are free, open source, and have become dramatically more approachable for everyday users over the last several years. That said, if you're specifically hunting for Windows keys, you likely need Windows for particular software or games that simply don't run natively on Linux. So it's not a universal fix, just a legitimate option worth knowing exists. Fifth, what about the even cheaper keys, labeled OEM? Those are technically meant to be bundled exclusively with new hardware sold by manufacturers, tied permanently to the specific machine they were activated on, and not transferable afterward. They're riskier than standard gray market keys precisely because reselling them separately from hardware falls outside their intended terms even more clearly. Yet they circulate widely anyway, and in practice tend to work just fine for a lot of buyers, at least until they don't. One more thing worth flagging, since a lot of viewers ask this specifically: how do you tell a reasonably trustworthy reseller from one you should avoid entirely? There's no bulletproof method, but a few signals matter. Look for storefronts that have been operating for years with a consistent, verifiable transaction history rather than one that popped up last month with suspiciously glowing reviews. Check whether they accept mainstream payment processors like PayPal or major card networks, since those companies have their own fraud protections and buyer disputes processes that give you some recourse if something goes wrong. Read the actual refund policy before you buy, not after, and see whether they explicitly address what happens if a key gets revoked. None of this guarantees anything, since even long-running storefronts occasionally deal in keys that eventually get pulled, but it meaningfully shifts the odds in your favor compared to grabbing the very cheapest listing you can find without checking anything at all. So here's where all of this actually lands. Cheap Windows keys work. More often than not, they're legally defensible under some version of resale or exhaustion principles, and they exist as a rational reaction to a licensing and pricing system that treats identical products as though they have wildly different values depending purely on which market you happen to be born into. Whether you personally decide to buy into that gray market or just pay full retail for the certainty of it is entirely up to you. But at least now you're making that call with the full picture instead of either extreme, not the version where cheap keys are framed as dangerous pirated malware waiting to wreck your machine, and not the version some reseller's marketing copy sells you where there's supposedly 0 risk involved at all. The real answer sits somewhere in the messy middle, same as most things around digital ownership tend to. If this helped clear things up, do the usual, like the video, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you catch the next one when it drops. And I'm genuinely curious about this one. If you found out today that the software you're running could be legally resold, what's the first thing you'd consider selling off once you were done with it? Drop it in the comments. I read everyone.